I've been asked to try to keep it boring. I think they were afraid of controversy, so apologies in advance if I managed to adhere to their instructions. It would be useful, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, it would be useful if you did have my paper in front of you, because I'm going to refer to one or two of the tables and a diagram in it. But what I'm going to do, so Eoin has the other Eoin Dail, has set out what the law says and the limits, the legal limits by which the Dail tend to last, are allowed to last, but what the law says doesn't always adhere to what actually happens in real life. And so what I'm going to do is talk about what happens in real life in Ireland, set out, first of all, how long Dail have lasted, look a little bit at the variation in the length of the Dail, look at under what circumstances some have lasted longer than others. I'll then look at the President's powers and how it's been used, and look very briefly at a couple of cases that actually Eoin's alluded to, and see what was happening there and what was probably driving the President's behaviour or decisions. And then look at the power, because a lot of this gets to the heart. The ability to call an election is really at the heart of political power, not just electoral politics, but also just every day. It's an important tool in an aspect that's constantly in politicians' minds. So we'll look at the effect of the ability to call election on how politics happens in Ireland. So first of all, on how long they last, well, the short answer is in Ireland, the average is 3 years and 4 months. Now, that doesn't mean that any Dail has actually lasted 3 years and 4 months, because it hides quite a lot of, an average will always hide a lot of variation. So if you can see figure 1 there, which unfortunately I don't have here, you'll see that there have been quite a number of very, very short Dails, particularly around 1981-82, where we had three Dail, just 3 elections, just one after another, it seemed. I remember it quite well. And then we tend to have most of them lasting around 4 to 5 years then. So there's a kind of a good bit of variation. Sometimes we have very short Dails, very short gaps between elections, and then most often we have around the Dail will last around 4 years. Now, when an election is called, or when a Dail is dissolved or falls, a government falls, it happens for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, there are a number of times where it's gone full term. And so in recent times, we can think of 4 examples where it's gone pretty much to legally full term. As Eoin said, it's kind of difficult to exactly say what the full length of the Dail is, because there's wiggle room there for Taoiseach about the length of an election campaign and how long you have to go between an election and the Dail actually formally meeting. But on 4 occasions we can say it's gone full term, and these have been quite recent. Most of these have been quite recent. So Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach, former Taoiseach, tended to like to go full term. He didn't see any reason to try and go early, and was one of the reasons he was probably so successful at staying in office. He kept his coalition partners quite happy. There was less of the kind of anxiety about will we call an early election, because he was a pretty highly skilled politician at that. The other way in which, and the most common way in which a Dail will fall, is that a Taoiseach will try to go early. And we could say that there might be 10 or 12 cases of this. I say 10 or 12 because sometimes the Dail has gone almost to full length, maybe 4.5 years, but it will go early, mainly because if it were to go the full term that it's legally allowed, it might end up having an election over the winter, which nobody really wants. Canvassers don't want, people don't, when canvassers knock on your door, you don't want to open the door and let all the warm air out. And then sometimes there are what you might think is odd events, but I mean, if there's a World Cup on, you don't want to have an election during a World Cup. Maybe immediately after, if the country is, if Ireland's done well, but usually you don't want to have an election during things like that because it makes it difficult. But we've seen about 12 cases where the Taoiseach has gone early, and I'll go into why that would be in a couple of minutes. And then there are another number of times where the Dáil an election has been called, or the Dáil has been dissolved because the government has lost the confidence of the Dáil. On 2 occasions that was formal, in 1982 and in 1992, there was a formal vote of confidence and the government had to resign, the Taoiseach had to resign because of it lost that formal vote. But on 5 other occasions, we can say it effectively was the same thing. A coalition collapsed, and you can see in Table 2, I kind of set out, Table 1, there's kind of that long table. You can it sets out more or less the different times of what these things, of how these things have happened. So we can see then on about 7 occasions, an election has been called not because the Taoiseach has wanted it, but because the Dáil has effectively wanted it. It withdrew its support from the government. Now, in those cases where there is a loss of confidence, whether it's formal or effective, so 2 formal cases of a loss of confidence and about 5 others where it's effectively happened, Eoin has set out that the President has some powers, that he or she can refuse the request of a Taoiseach to call a general election. And what we can see is that presidents tend to, well, they don't tend to, they do want to act legally and constitutionally, and I don't think there are any cases where they haven't tried to do that. But what they tend to do is to try and do what they might see as the best for the public good. And if that means refusing because there's an alternative government that can be formed, they might do that. If they believe that an election is unnecessary, they might try to indicate that. Now, so there have been a number of cases of this. One, and again, which were in the paper. One, it was in 1944, where it was during World War II, or the emergency, as we called it here, where the Fianna Fáil government, which was a minority government, lost a vote on a particular issue. It wasn't it wasn't a confidence issue, and De Valera sensed that because of the emergency, that if he were to go to the country to call an election, he might get a majority. He was good at that. He was a master at getting picking election timing. He went to the President, Douglas Hyde, whose initial reaction was to say no. There had been just an election less than a year earlier, and we probably knew that De Valera was able to maintain a majority in the Dáil, but De Valera wanted to have an election, and so then there was this question that Eoin referred to about, when do you have the confidence of the Dáil, or when do you don't have the confidence of the Dáil? Now, the secretary to the president at the time, who was very aged and I think bedridden, convinced Douglas Hyde that, look, there's no other government possible, and so then he eventually granted the election, which De Valera managed to win and get his majority. In 1982, around this time, where there were about 3 elections in quick succession, because Fine Gael had been doing particularly well and Fianna Fáil was struggling to get a majority. It was used to getting a majority every now and again. There was a kind of a change in the political system to some extent at that time. And in 1982, the Fine Gael Labour coalition, which was itself a minority government, collapsed. The Fianna Fáil leader, Charles Haughey, from just down the road, he sensed that he could form a government without an election. They didn't really want to have an election because elections were costly, and they'd already had one pretty recently. And so he sent Brian Lenihan, his sidekick, to Paddy Hillery out to the Áras an Uachtaráin to convince Paddy Hillery not to allow the election to go ahead. Paddy Hillery, the president, thought that this was inappropriate, refused to meet with them, and he granted the Taoiseach's wish for an election. In 1994, there was a collapse of a government between Fianna Fáil and Labour. Albert Reynolds was the Taoiseach. He was, at that time, this was the second government that he had kind of presided over that had fallen in acrimonious circumstances. And it was seen that it was more or less the end of his political career. And he felt, it is reported, or not reported, he told me, he felt that his only chance was to have an election. If he could get an election, he might be able to salvage his political career. Mary Robinson, who was the president, never, as Eoin said, never formally vetoed, but it was through back channels. Albert Reynolds was told effectively that if he were to formally ask for the dissolution of the Dáil, she would formally refuse it, and so use that power. And so we can see that the power was never used, but it had an effect. This is kind of anticipated reactions. So even powers that aren't actually ever used are still effective and can be quite powerful. Now, in terms of how the powers are used by the Taoiseach, just in terms of how Taoiseach have all been how they manage to benefit from it. We can think of two areas in which you can benefit. One is electorally, and the second is just in day-to-day policy. And I think that this power is probably important in both those areas. There is what we can call a cost of ruling in government. If you are in government wherever in the world, there's a cost of ruling. Depending on what data set you look at, it's usually around 4 points, that the government will lose 4 points just by being in government. There's good reasons for that. One is that because you got into government, you probably did pretty well, and you might just be going back down to where you normally are. But it's also because the act of governing is very often involves making compromises and unpopular decisions. And so you will tend to lose. And in Ireland, the average loss to a government party, to a Taoiseach's party rather, is about 2.8 percentage points, which doesn't sound big, but is actually quite big, because that 2.8 percentage points can mean quite a lot of seats. It could be that could be kind of 5 to 10 seats. That could be the difference between you governing or not governing. And we can see, and I think I set out in another table, table 2, on the left-hand side of table 2. No, not that side. Actually, I'm not sure where I put it. No, I think it's in the text. We can see that that cost of governing differs in different places. Oh yeah, sorry, it is table 2. And so we can see that, if a government goes to full term, the loss to the Taoiseach's party is about 3 points. Whereas if you've lost confidence, it's about a 6-point loss. That 3-point difference is pretty big. And if a government falls by the Taoiseach's choice, the loss is only closer to 0. And so you can think of the difference between not losing many votes and losing 6 percentage points of votes. That's quite big, and that's quite important, and would suggest that the ability to call an election is pretty important for a Taoiseach and has some electoral effects. Now, those differences are not what we call statistically significant, but that's mainly probably because it's a really small data set and it's very hard to get what people call statistical significance out of that. But they're in the right direction. They're more or less the way in which you would see them go in other places. And so what I think we can conclude reasonably is that the ability to call an election does tend to benefit the Taoiseach's party. But it doesn't always do so. So we could see, and in the case earlier I mentioned, in 1944 it did help the Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera's party. A couple of years later, in 1948, the government called a reasonably early election, and the the government lost seats. Now, what it was doing in 1948, it was, at that time, there was a new party on the rise. It was called Clon na Poblachta, which many of you may have heard of. It was led by Sean McBride, who was quite a charismatic, unusual figure, and it was organising, and the country was kind of a political side of the country was kind of awash with talk about this new political movement that was going to burst onto the scene. De Valera was kind of worried about this, and so in order to not give it the time to organise for an election, he called an early election, which, even though De Valera's party, Fianna Fáil, lost lots of seats in that election, it may have avoided it losing a lot more had Clon na Poblachta had the chance to develop as a political party. We can also see that politicians, that Taoiseach who call early elections can often make mistakes. So in 1977, the Fine Gael Taoiseach, Liam Cosgrave, called an early election, and it was an utter disaster. They thought they were being terribly clever. They thought they had more or less gerrymandered the constituencies in order to guarantee a majority for the incumbent government, but the public thought different of it, and it was they only commissioned an opinion poll just in a week after they had called the election, which led one of the ministers to say, can we undissolve the Dáil? They ended up losing to a landslide for Fianna Fáil. We can also see in 1989, Fianna Fáil made mistakes. Charles J. Hoy thought that we could see opinion polls were doing really well. Fianna Fáil was close to 50% in opinion polls. And the economy was picking up in the late 1980s, and we had there was lots of good news stories. Stephen Roach had won the Tour de France. The soccer team was doing well. I think we may have even had good weather in the summer, and he decided to everything was aligned perfectly, so that he'd call an election. Nothing could go wrong. A bit like Theresa May last year in the UK, and it did go wrong. Not quite as spectacularly wrong as it did for Theresa May in the UK, but it went wrong. He lost a couple of seats, and he ended up having to go into coalition with kind of his up to then nemesis. And a lot of that happens because a Taoiseach going early takes the risk of being blamed for an unnecessary election. It happened again in 1992 when Albert Reynolds was blamed for calling an early election. And what we can see there is that actually junior coalition partners in 1992 and more recently have got quite a bit of power. So it is known, for instance, that Enda Kenny wanted to call an election in late 2015, but that his coalition partners refused, or persuaded him at least not to do it. So even though they didn't have a legal right to veto this, they had an effective political right. And we can also see that, if that right to threaten an election is only potent when the opinion polls are going in a certain way. So there's no point in threatening to call an election if everybody knows it's going to damage the person who actually calls the election. So just finally then on policy effects. Now we know that those policy effects are constant and everyday. Government ministers say that when they are negotiating with each other, in the back of their mind, they always know, is this an issue that we would go to the country on? And if it isn't, then they have to kind of think again. So is this an issue that we would allow the government to fall on? So that power is there all of the time, but it's not something that is solely potent for the Taoiseach's party. It's also important for the junior coalition partner, or even in the current circumstances of confidence and supply, we know that Fianna Fáil can effectively call an election. So the effective right to call an election is one that's held not just by the Taoiseach or the Taoiseach's party, it's also held by any group that a Taoiseach needs to maintain support. So just, I suppose, to conclude, what we can see is that the President has powers and they're not without force. Presidents have tended to act to avoid what might be seen as unnecessary elections. The power to dissolve is legally with the Taoiseach, and Taoiseach's party tend to benefit from it, but politically anybody whose support is needed is going to have that power to dissolve or to maintain the government. And so the power effects that the right, and I suppose finally, last point, the power effects of the right to dissolve the Dáil is highly contingent. It really isn't just a big club that we give a Taoiseach. That can be that big club can be turned into sort of a rubber baton if the Taoiseach's party isn't doing well in the polls, or if there's an issue in which the Taoiseach wouldn't want to go to the country on. Okay, thank you.